So please join me in welcoming two very smart people who I appreciate tremendously, Jill and Christian.
Thank you. And clicker? This is clicker. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We've set the bar. Nikki's set the bar pretty high for us, so hopefully we can fulfill that expectation. I'm Jill Bishop, founder and CEO of Multilingual Connections. We're a Chicago-based language and culture consultancy. We do bilingual moderation, translation, and transcription in about 75 different languages. And here with Christian.
I'm Christian Aloma. I'm the founder and CEO of Threadline, a narrative-based research agency that focuses on storytelling. Jill, tell me a story about yourself.
Absolutely. So once upon a time, I was a graduate student in linguistic anthropology. I was looking at a language called Judeo-Spanish, or Ladino, spoken by the descendants of the Jews who were exiled from Spain in 1492. I spent about a year in Israel with this community of speakers, listening to their stories, listening to them sing songs and connect with each other in a number of different languages. And very rarely was there a moment where they were just speaking one language and not another. It was Ladino, it was Hebrew, it was French, it was English, all interwoven. The photo at the top of the screen is a group of gentlemen who had survived Auschwitz from the city of Thessaloniki. They were among the 2,000 out of, I think, 56,000 that made it out. And I would spend days with them and listen to them tell stories about the price of apricots in the market, the bus driver, their experiences losing everyone they knew in Auschwitz. And they would the way that they would interweave these stories was incredible to experience. And they would switch from one language to another, sometimes between stories, sometimes within a story, and sometimes within the same sentence. I would spend time with women who would sing songs and tell these traditional stories that they had no idea were 500 years old. They just knew that their Aunt Donna had told them. And so here we have this group of maybe 60,000 speakers worldwide. Most of them were an average of 70, 75 years old. And the man at the microphone, Vitaly, stood up in front of a group one day and he claimed to be the only stand-up comedian in Ladino. And he said that Ladino is more than a language, it's a travel agency. And I really saw that clearly that year as I watched what people did with language and through language, and how language connected them to their past and to each other and catapulted them into the future. And it really helped me frame the way that we at Multilingual Connections look at language and the work that we do with our clients. And Christian, your turn. Tell me a story.
Sure. As a little bit of background, I come from a large Caribbean family, Jamaican, Cuban, Lebanese, Scottish, supposedly, as well. As a result, I end up doing a lot of code switching as well that Jill was just describing, into a Jamaican accent, depending on if I'm speaking with my Jamaican family, into Spanish if I'm speaking with my Spanish family, things like that. But one of the memories when we were talking about the session that came up is how we understand kind of cultures in context. And oftentimes when you go to these kinds of events, like you get asked about, did you get to some of the local restaurants? Did you try any of the local foods, the barbecue here in Texas, things like that? And I'm often asked what's my favorite place to eat. And unabashedly, it's McDonald's. McDonald's is by far my favorite restaurant in the world. And I can tell you right now, it's not because of the food at McDonald's, right? It's because as a 9, 10, 11-year-old, raised as a first-generation American to parents who were both working every day as teachers and then working in the evening at a bakery, a local bakery in South Florida, my grandparents would take all of us boys, there were 3 of us plus my 2 sisters, to McDonald's every Saturday, right? And I basically grew up in McDonald's, right? So I remember going from Happy Meals to double cheeseburgers to that big day when I got a Big Mac, and it was really amazing, and playing on the play place and doing all of these things. And so today, when I tell people about my love of McDonald's, it has very little to do with the food at McDonald's. It has much more to do with my grandparents, right? McDonald's connects me to those moments, to those contexts, to, in many regards, that culture, because it was on the way to McDonald's that we learned Spanish vocabulary, and on the way back from McDonald's that we learned Spanish vocabulary. And so today, when I take my own kids to McDonald's, as much as my wife might hate the fact that I'm feeding my kids McDonald's, I'm giving them a little bit of my own culture, if you will, my own personal experience of culture in those ways. And so for me, McDonald's is far more than a restaurant. It's not just golden arches, it's golden open arms in my mind for my family and I.
Golden open arms.
That's right.
Love that.
That's right.
And these stories, we tell stories to create our experiences and to make sense of our experiences and to connect with other people. And when you're doing research globally, it's obviously much more challenging to do that when you're working in multilingual environments. Not long ago, I was at a conference and I was talking to a colleague who I didn't realize had grown up in Italy and was actually a native speaker of Italian, but I'd only known him to speak English. And he was talking about how his personality was different when he was speaking Italian and when he was, and I see some heads nodding, when he's speaking Italian and when he was speaking English. And it made me think about my experience as a junior in college living in Barcelona, where I was good at Spanish, but I couldn't really connect in a way that felt authentic to me with my friends there. And I realized that my friends knew Jill, they didn't know Jill. And Jill was this girl who was a little bit shyer, a little more reserved. She couldn't really tell a joke. She was kind of on the outskirts of the group, and I was trapped, and I couldn't really connect in the way that I wanted to. And so I posed a question to my team. We're a team of 25 across like 10 countries. And I said, are you the same people in translation? And how does your personality change? And these are people who work in English every day. And it was really interesting to hear story after story of how people's views of themselves and the way that they connect with people are so different depending on the language. And so I wound up writing a blog about it, but I brought in this one example from Hatice, who is a native Turkish speaker. And I found it really interesting the way that she talked about how at one point in her life, she was actually able to express her emotions better in English, and that she had an optimistic way of thinking in English, even though she was a native Turkish speaker. And she said now she's able to express herself better in Turkish. She can joke around a lot more. But her point, the moment my subconscious is aware that the person across from me speaks English, I switch to a mixed code of language. And that was a theme that came up over and over again, that ability to code switch. And we think about code switching oftentimes as a situational code switching, where at work I speak this language, at home I speak this language, or with my grandparents I speak this, with my parents I speak this. But that's a situational code switching. Metaphorical is where you're switching to a different language because of what that means. Not because that other person doesn't understand it, but because there's an extra layer of meaning there. And so this is the type of thing that when you're doing work internationally, you want to make sure that you're not losing sight, that you're not just understanding what people are saying, but understanding what they mean.
Yeah.
And so, Christian, why don't you tell the group about the project that we worked on together?
Yeah, so last year we worked on a project with Jill and her team trying to understand luxury and wellness across the world. And it was a big undertaking. It was a number of interviews conducted in local languages, across the Middle East. And of course, when you're conducting even research across the Middle East, there's different variations of Arabic that you have to know and what those ideas mean. And then we're also looking at luxury set to a cultural context, right? And luxury, for example, in the United States feels very different from luxury in China or luxury in India. And so it was really important for us, for a client that's trying to create a global brand to appeal to high net worth individuals around a luxury experience, that we understood not just what luxury meant within each of those cultures, but then what are the threads that tie all of those different variations of luxury together. And so we worked with the team, and there's the basics that you expect, of course, any language agency to do, which is translating our screeners and translating our guides and doing all of that sort of stuff. But the way we approach storytelling in our interviews is not just traditional moderation. It is built on a foundation of narrative psychology, which looks at the way that people don't just how they tell stories, but what those stories mean to them. And so it was really critical to us that I didn't just pull in a Spanish speaker from the US that could conduct research with the Spanish participants, things like that, but that we had someone who really understood the nuances of the language, that understood that the way someone said things and what that meant, or even the sentence means something entirely different because of when it's said in the story. And Jill's example earlier reminded me when we would visit Jamaica and talk to some of our cousins in Jamaica, and we were talking to one of my older uncles, about his mother and whether his mother was a warm, loving kind of mother or a strict, sort of aggressive mother. And he responded back to us, and he said this in Patois. He said, "You know him and Evie." And the thing about Jamaican Patois is you often add H's where there wasn't an H, and you drop an H where there should have been an H. And so if you translate that to traditional English, it says, "His hand was heavy." Now, in Patois, basically everyone is gendered masculine. So he was talking about his mother, but said his hand is heavy here in an effort to explain how much his mother beat him as a child, right? And so if you were just translating that, you didn't understand that he was talking about his mother, or the fact that when you say someone's hand is heavy, they're talking about the fact that they're beating you. And so this is the kind of nuance that we needed to understand. And so the team went across all of these countries, and it wasn't just moderators. Again, my background's a PhD in psychology, so I'm looking for social scientists in these markets, right? And so it's someone who understands the culture, but also has a background in design thinking, has a background in clinical psychology, has a background in anthropology, so that they can hear those stories and then not just translate those stories, but interpret those stories for us, to help us really see that in the UK, luxury may be about butlers and that sort of thing, whereas in Qatar, it was about sort of complete, absolute choice, that anything you wanted was possible, right? And those were the nuance that we wouldn't have picked up on our own, or wouldn't have just picked up with a traditional moderator supplied by a traditional recruiting agency in a traditional facility.
And Christian, you mentioned something when we were talking about the Hindi moderator. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we had one of our moderators conducting the interviews in India, and it was really interesting to us. We were recruiting a high net worth individual sort of audience, and we had recruited this individual to, of course, speak the local language. They also spoke English quite well. And one of the things when we got recordings and when we got the recordings back, we were expecting to hear the interpreter, the live translator translating our interviews. But our Hindi moderator recognized some of her participants wanted to switch to English to talk about certain concepts, and so she switched to English with them. And then when they were talking about something else, they switched back into Hindi. And our interviews go through early experiences to recent experiences, and we often heard it was those early experiences where they were kind of back into their native language, and then talking about their more recent, more modern experiences and experiences around luxury and materialism, where they switched then into the English language. And that moderator knew to do that. It wasn't a thing that we told her, go ahead, or we gave everyone permission to switch to English. She just understood the participants that were there well enough to know when they were comfortable or when their idea was sort of an English-anchored idea versus a Hindi-anchored idea.
Right. And back to the conversations with our team, that same woman, Hatija, talked about any time that she was in a mental health situation, she had to have somebody who could speak both English and Turkish, because there were so many times where she'd want to go back and forth.
Yeah.
And so having that flexibility of language and language choice, not just which language do you want to use, but which languages do you want to use? Because at different times you are going to need a different language potentially to really express on an emotional level. And, thinking about that idea of a travel agency, language connects us to each other. It connects us to our past, to our present. It helps us make sense of our lives and catapult us into the future. And so it's essential to work to understand not just what people are saying, but what they're doing with language and what they're experiencing and what they're creating with language. And of course, sometimes there's a budgetary issue and you feel like you need to do an interview in English. And certainly there are 1,000 AI options, and those all of that has value. But when you're really looking to get at the emotional content of people's stories and get to that, all of the deep nuances that can make a difference, giving people that choice and connecting with them in their language is essential. Nelson Mandela said that if you speak to a man in his language, it goes to his head. But if you speak to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his language, it goes to his heart. And so when you're really trying to connect with people, make that connection, understand their experiences, giving them those choices of language can make all the difference. So Anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's critically important in my work in narrative psychology where we talk about stories define who we are. And it's not just the story that defines who we are, it's the way we tell those stories to ourselves that define who we are. And so if you really want to understand someone, it's not just about collecting stories. It's not just about surveying and collecting answers. It's about hearing that story in their language. And so I'd almost flip Nelson's quote here to say, listen to them in their language and you truly understand their heart.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. We have a few minutes if there are any questions.
There is a question for you. Oh, I don't know if you can hear me because you can't hear the speakers. The question for you is, it's basically asking if you can go into a little bit more depth around the Hindi code switching and how that impacted the findings and the research.
Sure. Yeah, it was an interesting scenario. One of the things that we noticed with the Hindi interviews was that, so to set context, right? When you conduct interviews in the US, there's a very different dynamic in the interview room compared to when you're conducting interviews in other cultures, right? So when we talk to physicians in the US, there is very much not fully a sort of equal relationship between the folks in the room, but there is a little bit more of, listen, doctor, I'm here and I'm here to ask you questions. I've asked you to be here, and there's this sort of relationship, this contract that's been created where you're going to give me answers to my questions, right? When you conduct research with a physician, for example, in Japan, there is a different hierarchical sort of respect of that physician in the interview compared to that moderator. So there's a lot more deference to that individual. Now, what we were noticing in the interviews with India, at least we noticed it afterwards, the moderator sort of picked up on this even without our direction, was as these individuals were telling stories, we could see that as we were getting deeper and deeper into concepts of luxury and concepts of wellness, which became really sort of personal to them, they started to kind of get a little hesitant, a little bit sort of more restrictive about what they were sharing. It wasn't until they switched into English that we really started to hear them say, well, I can talk about this way, and here's what luxury means at this level. Because for them, it was a little bit more of sort of a worldly experience from what we could interpret from the interviews, right? And so they had to sort of use concepts and framing and language that was in a different language than Hindi for them. Because for them, what we often heard was they talked about wellness in Hindi, but luxury is something sort of slightly different. Luxury sort of ended up being in a slightly different language for them. So that was sort of a little bit of the insight difference that we heard. The biggest difference was they became much more comfortable in the room sharing their stories because the moderator who's collecting these stories acknowledged how and when they wanted to share the stories that they wanted to share. And that was really critical.
Thank you. Excellent. That was your last question.
All right.
So, join me in
Thanks, everybody.
Jill and Kristen.
Thank you.
You both. And now it's food time. So